So then, how did we, the modern Homo sapiens, which I should say actually is Latin for wise man or wise person, how did the Homo sapiens of 150,000 years ago develop into the Homo sapiens that we are currently today? If the biology and the physiology and the genetic evolution has remained relatively unchanged over that time, because that is a very small amount of time in terms of when you're thinking of the evolutionary clock. And so moving to the next slide 13, which has a bunch of different sort of pictures and graphs overlaying one another. That starts with big gods, you'll see. And I apologize for this overlaying, of course. If I'm presenting this lecture in class, I can do these slide animations as I go through. This makes it a little bit more tricky, so I would suggest downloading the PowerPoint, and as you're following along, going through the slideshow itself as if you would be seeing it in class. So apologies for that ahead of time. Anyway, so the archaeological and anthropological evidence, and now psychological evidence, is suggesting that we humans started to become the humans that we recognize today, the sort of cultural and advanced technological humans, at a time about, the tipping point was about 12,000 years ago. And so there was a lot of different things that happened in that time. And so there were different hypotheses formulated by different researchers and scientists and academics to suggest that, well, this was the one thing that led to the development of modern human culture and groups. So one of those, you'll see the graph here on this slide. On the x-axis, you have, let me just pull it up on my end. On the x-axis, you have body weight in kilograms, and then on the y-axis, you have brain weight in grams. And so this fits with the hypothesis that's called the big brain hypothesis. So we humans have, unlike our closest great ape ancestors and closest cousins, we have this very large spongy frontal cortex, or the prefrontal cortex. And all of the computations and the processes and the cognitive processes that happen in this part of the brain allow us to do the things and to behave in the way that humans behave. So things like impulse control, executive function, different symbolic and language processing, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the part of the brain that allows us to be human and to be separate from other non-human species. And so if you look at this graph, you can see humans sort of sit above that trend line that's moving through that positive sloped line. And that suggests that we have a very large brain with respect to our overall body size. So some researchers make the claim that human culture and technology and modern advancement happened because of this large brain that we have. So that's one hypothesis. A second hypothesis is called the food diversity hypothesis. And basically, as animals, any sort of animal has two competing or conflicting urges or motivations when it comes to food. You can exploit or you can explore. So you can exploit the current food source if you are at a current food source, or you can explore other possible alternatives or opportunities if they present themselves. And there's a sort of back and forth in terms of what is more beneficial for the individual human or non-human animal. And so that fits in with this hypothesis because some people make the claim that the more developed and the more advanced the species, the more diverse the food sources, so the more variety of food that you eat. And so we see that humans, compared to other species, eat a large variety of different foods. When you look at other animals, non-human animals, you see that they tend to eat a very limited diet. Like they stick to 1, 2, or 3 main things throughout their entire life. And so they exploit that over and over and over again. There was a point, however, in humans, in the human evolutionary history, that we began to explore more food options. And this might align with the development of fire, because since fire allowed us, as I said a few minutes back, since fire allowed us to cook our foods, there were probably now different foods that we wouldn't have been able to eat otherwise raw. But now with the invention of fire, maybe we would have been able to prepare the food differently and digest it and eat it and get and pull nutrition from that food source. So that's the food diversity hypothesis, and they think that the greater the variety of the food, the greater the self-control, the more complex the cognition of that thing. And so they think that humans and the advancement of our modern species was related to this sort of greater diversity in food sources. The next hypothesis is related to symbology and language representation. And this is the idea that, of course, humans are probably the only species that have a grasp on language. There's some gorillas and higher order primates can sign, but to nowhere near the extent that we as species have the capacity to have language and to communicate and express ourselves through language. And so this is related to symbology or symbolism. And language is, when you think of language, we don't typically think of language in this way, but language is simply symbols. So we have an internal state, we have an internal representation of how we feel or some sort of thought, and to have a word as represented in a language to represent that feeling state is simply a symbolic representation of that thing or of that situation. And so what came with symbology, symbolism, and the development of language was our ability to talk to others, to other humans. And then suddenly that probably led to the proliferation of cultural transmission and the spread of ideas within a population. You can imagine how much more efficient and effective we would have been as a species if we could simply talk to our conspecifics to tell them, hey, there's a food source under that rock. If you just walk 10 steps east or 10 steps that way, you'll find a yummy food, as opposed to some other non-linguistic way to express that information. So ideas were copied and replicated with much greater ease because of language, and that then led to the advancement of humans and groups and culture and so on and so on and so on. Probably the most recent hypothesis is the agricultural revolution, and this points to this 12,000 year ago mark in history. And it's pretty much agreed upon now that this might be the most impactful cultural change that happened in the development of humans, modern humans. And so what happened 12,000 years ago was we began to settle down. We began to stay put. So if you remember, we said that the earlier groups in the EEA were nomadic, and we traveled and we followed herds of animals and food sources. About 12,000 years ago, we began to stay put. And what happened with that is two things. We domesticated animals to do a lot of the work that needed to be done. And we began to plant. And we began to develop the first proto-agricultural farming technologies. And so we planted crops and we harvested crops, and those, reliably again and again became our food sources. And as I said, we domesticated animals, goats, chickens, horses, cows, any sort of pastoral farming animal, which either helped us with the work or then became food sources in and of themselves. And so what happened with the agricultural revolution of 12,000 years ago, is more food became available to us. So this relates to the food diversity hypothesis. So these are never completely separate hypotheses. These very much are interrelated. So that allowed greater food sources. It allowed for the technological growth in the techniques surrounding farming and agriculture. And interestingly, what happened, and this relates to the image of the big God book here, what happened with the agricultural revolution is that groups simply began to grow much larger. So we used to exist in these small nomadic tribes of no more than 150, if you remember. But then all of a sudden we became successful. We began to flourish in group size because we were staying put, and we began to survive longer and to have more offspring in these sort of centralized locations and areas. And so that number began to exceed the minimum 150. And so what happened is that researchers and academics make the argument is that this is the exact time when culture began to develop, and not just culture, but, well, related to culture, things like morality, law, legal systems, and above all, most importantly, religion. And it was religion, they say, that really propelled or launched our human species into the contemporary Homo sapiens that we know today. And why religion came about and why big gods, big deities came about is related to this growth in group size. So as groups exceeded the 150, we no longer could reliably detect friend from foe, or we couldn't hold in memory who we ought to trust and who we ought not to trust. And so religion and big gods became a sort of built-in mechanism for fast-growing groups that ensured the successful cooperation and trust and loyalty for everyone within a group. So we always have cheaters, we always have liars, we always have defectors within a group. And if you can't keep everyone in check because the group is so large, how will you know if you can trust them? And the best way to do that is to have a supernatural being, like a god or a deity, who is at all times and at once perfectly omniscient and omnipotent. And so if I'm that person who is, maybe I'm considering stealing my neighbor's food source without telling him or her, maybe I plan on coveting his or her partner, what would prevent me or deter me from engaging in these sort of quote-unquote immoral behaviors is the fear that I'm being monitored and that I'm being watched by a big, all-knowing, omnipotent, omniscient God. And so that would deter me from being bad and from being immoral, and would encourage me to be respectful and cooperative and altruistic towards my neighbor, towards my fellow group member. And so religion, in line with the agricultural boom, in line with the fast-growing groups, led to the advancement of modern religion, and that then thrust us forward into the modern day, where we can exist in groups, past the thousands and the hundreds of thousands and the millions and the 10 millions and now hundreds of millions and even billions. We can exist as a species and cooperate with each other in a way that allows everyone to be successful and to survive, more or less. There's obviously caveats to that all the time, but we boomed as a species in our population growth because of these different factors along the way. So